Hello, I'm Cliff Brockman with producer Paul Yeager. This is another of our oral history interviews for the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting. Today is November 18th, 2024. Today our guest is Kris Ketz of KMBC-TV, almost stumbled over that, in Kansas City. And we'll be talking to Kris today about his dad, Jim King, the legendary anchor and TV newsman in the Quad Cities. Before we start, Kris, I just want to mention that for 16 years out of my career, I worked at WQAD, and all of those years I worked with your dad. And he was not only a friend to me, but a real mentor. So it's just exciting for me to be able to talk to you about him.
Listen, you won't be upset if I ask you questions about your 16 years with my dad during the course of this interview, will you?
No, it'll be fine. There are plenty of stories I could tell too, I'm sure. So let's start at the beginning.
Oh, I'll bet.
Kris,
I'll bet.
How did, and one thing I was going to mention too is that we affectionately called him Kinger, not only in the newsroom, but in the station. So if I slip up tonight and call him Kinger, why, you'll understand where that's coming from, I'm sure.
You'll love this, and I'll answer your question. You'll love this. Not only have I remember when, I mean, that's all people called my dad in the newsroom, the term Kinger. They call me Ketzer here. So, there's a little bit of a connection there. But to your question about how did he get started, his broadcasting career really started when he was in the Air Force back in the 50s. And he was stationed, long story short, in the Azores, which is where he met my mom. And he was part of Armed Forces Radio at the time. And that's how I suppose he kind of caught the broadcasting bug. He did dance shows, and there was a lot of disc jockeying and reading news and sports and all those kinds of things. But I think that's where he kind of got the bug. And so when it was time to leave the service, he marries my mom. And she is from Bakersfield, California. And so when they finally got off the island, Bakersfield was the first place that they went. And he was, at the time, in the process of just trying to find a job somewhere in broadcasting. And again, he never really got any sort of traction in terms of a job. And so from Bakersfield, he and my mom to his home in Chicago, which is where he grew up, and then he started sending out resumes once again. And sure enough, he got a bite, and it was from the what is now the ABC station in Omaha, KETV, which oddly enough is owned by Hearst Television, which is the parent company of KMBC here in Kansas City. But his first job was at what is now Newswatch 7 in Omaha, and he was doing sports, oddly enough. The ironic part about that was that my father really didn't know anything about sports, but he could read scores and he could read stories, and so that's kind of how his career started at Channel 7 in Omaha. But what was also interesting too, this is 1957-ish, 58, and so my father was known as Jim King in the Quad Cities for decades, certainly. But, and there are people who know this certainly in the Quad Cities, but there are probably a lot of people who didn't. His real name was Ketz. But for whatever reason, the people in charge of Channel 7 in Omaha at the time thought that the last name Ketz sounded too ethnic for the time. And so they made him change it. And so he changed it to King and just kept it as an air name till the day he died.
Certainly how he was known, that's for sure. Well, then he got to QAD. QAD had just gone on the air. He was an original employee there, I believe, back in 1963. They were the ABC affiliate, still are. Tell us what happened then. Was he sports director there?
That was an interesting. Yeah, he came to WQAD again as sports director. WQAD at the time was just signing on August 1st, 1963, and so this was a startup on so many levels, including putting together a staff. And I think my dad, and there might have been 2 or 3 other staff members there at Channel 7 in Omaha that were hired by the new people in charge, a group of about 23 business people in the Quad Cities, mostly Moline. It was a group called Moline Television Corporation, led by a guy named Art Swift, who had broadcasting experience up in the Twin Cities. But that group hired my dad, and again, I think a couple of other people from KETV in Omaha to come to the Quad Cities, to this brand new place, to this brand new television station, and that's how he signed on with Channel 8. Now, he came as sports director, but after about, I think a year or a year and a half, they decided to let the person who was doing news at the time go, and they put my dad into that particular position, and the rest, as they say, is history.
He must have liked it there because he stayed there until 1999 when he passed on. Must have liked it and raised his family there.
I was just going to say he had multiple. That's okay. He had multiple opportunities to go to other places, and I think if there had been a job offer, perhaps from Chicago, given the fact that he grew up in the Windy City, I think he might have jumped at the chance. I remember a time when he was seriously considering a job in San Francisco, and ultimately turned that one down as well. I think at the end of the day, his priority was finding a home, putting down roots, and raising a family. And he always felt like the Quad Cities was a terrific place to raise a family. And so he didn't want to do, that was his first priority, and he didn't want to do anything to disrupt that. And so that's why not only did he come to the Quad Cities, but he made it home and was obviously on the air until the day he died on January 2nd, 1999. But as far as major stories that you asked about, Cliff, you know, every spring, a decent-sized flood was almost guaranteed. Not just the Mississippi River, but certainly the Rock River and other tributaries in the two-state area. You know, there were some pretty good floods along the Wapsie-Pinnacon River that I recall from way back when. But certainly the flood of 1965 was one that I recall. There were a couple of big ones certainly in the early 70s that took downtown Davenport by storm, and I remember, and we all remember the pictures of what was then John O'Donnell Stadium, what is now Modern Woodman Stadium in downtown Davenport, just underwater. But you know, the floods were obviously big stories way back when that he covered. Probably the one story, Cliff, that I think he was best known for happened in the summers of 1966 and 1967, when he and a photographer went to Vietnam to talk to local service men and women who were involved in the war in Vietnam, and brought those stories back home to the Quad Cities. And the backstory there was, I don't know that there were an awful lot of local television stations, especially the size of WQAD, that committed that kind of time, that kind of money. That certainly couldn't have been cheap. It wouldn't be cheap today. But the fact that a television station the size of WQAD committed to a story like that, I think really said a lot about the people who were in charge of WQAD at the time. Now, I think, to be fair, I think there was a commercial element to this, because at the time, WOC-TV, Channel 6, which is now KWQC, was the clear market leader. They had been around forever, and people, generations of Quad Cityans had grown up watching Channel 6. And I think there was a thought at the time that if you're Channel 8, you got to do something kind of out of the box to try to get people to watch you. And I think that probably entered into the decision to make that kind of a trip, not once but twice, to Southeast Asia. And so Dad went there, and the response was just nothing like I've ever seen before. I still have people, Cliff, I still have people reach out to me from the Quad Cities or from other places in the Midwest, even here in Kansas City. People who remember when they were interviewed by my father, and who remembered those stories being on the air on Channel 8, and still look back at that time with such warm feelings. Now, the '67 trip, when he went back for a second time, That trip ended a lot sooner than he would have liked. That was a trip where he almost lost his life. He and a newspaper reporter from the Orlando Sentinel got a little bit too close to a Viet Cong mortar that hit just right outside Da Nang, which of course there was an enormous U.S. military presence in Da Nang. There was a big air base there. And he and that newspaper reporter got a little, as I say, a little bit, as I put it, a little bit too close to that VC mortar. And my dad ended up spending about a month in a hospital in Saigon. And I'll never forget the phone call home to my mom telling her of what had happened. And I don't recall I don't know if it was my dad who was on the other end of the phone or if it was somebody else. But again, I'll never forget that moment in the living room at the house that I grew up in Moline, when the day we got that call, and just how close my dad came to becoming a casualty. But when he came back, again, he continued to put together those stories of members of the military from the Quad Cities, and again, I think it helped. It certainly helped cement his place in Quad City and I think Iowa broadcasting as well.
Well, there's another trip that he made when I was there. He went to Beirut, Lebanon. There was a civil war going on, and we sent him, well, I didn't send him, but the news director sent him, and a photographer over to talk to some of the surviving service members from the Quad Cities area. There had been a couple of truck bombs that blew up and killed over a couple hundred people. And so they went over and interviewed some of the survivors. And I talked to Lane Mickelson just the other day when I was getting ready for this interview, because he was the photographer that went. And he said that when they went, your dad bribed his way through customs to get him through. And then while they were there, they went to some places that the networks couldn't get to, and the networks called them and asked for copies of Kinger and Lane's video because they couldn't get in. So, I had to kind of chuckle over that like you're chuckling now. I mean, he was just that kind of guy. He was a newsman, and he was really fearless on one hand, and on the other hand, he could just kind of talk his way through stuff. It was amazing.
Well, I was just gonna the trip to Beirut. I remember that one vividly too as a kid, and of course, I was a little surprised that Dad would want to go back into what was clearly a war zone, especially given what almost happened in Vietnam in '67. But again, I think my dad, and you mentioned Lane Mickelson. Ironically enough, Lane Mickelson shot the first television package I'd ever done in the business, and so so our connections there are deep, and Lane's one of the best in the industry, no question about that. But I think, like I say, if there was a story to be told, he loved telling stories. He really did. He was awfully good behind the desk doing kind of what I'm doing right now, but his real passion and his real delight and joy in the business was going out and telling other people's stories. And I've always said, anybody can read a teleprompter, but if you're going to be really good doing what this job entails, you really need to be a good reporter first. And that was something that I learned watching my dad all those years growing up in the Quad Cities. I always knew that this was something that I wanted to do, but he was just such an incredible role model for me, and the lessons that I learned just watching what he did on a daily basis are lessons that carry me to this day. And when he passed away on January 2nd, 1999, pushing a snowblower on a day when there was a foot of snow in the Quad Cities, certainly he didn't have any plans on checking out that day, and nor did anybody else. But among the regrets that I have, there are so many. We talk so much about the business as I got to Kansas City and as my career here was developing, we would talk on the phone, heck, 3-4 times a week easily. But you know, there were so many more things about what he did and how he did it, conversations that we never had a chance to have because he passed away when he did. And I'll tell you, it goes down as one of my great regrets. Always will be.
You know, since you brought that up, it always has touched me that, I mean, he was a news guy. You know, I mean, here it is. There's a blizzard going on. I had just gone over to Channel 4 at that point as the news director just a few weeks before that. There's this blizzard going on. Now, I don't know what it is, 5:30 in the morning. He's out there pushing a snowblower so that he can get out and get to work to cover the blizzard. Now, here's a guy who's been in the business. He's the anchor man. You know, he passed away doing what he loved, I guess, trying to get in to cover the story.
Cliff, you know this. I appreciate that more than you know. But yeah, he passed away doing what he loved, and I suppose if you're going to go, that's the way to go. I think he would have. That's the way he would have wanted to go, wanting again, heading to work, something that he loved to do. Even at the age of 65, even later in his career, it was still something that he loved to do, and you know, he wasn't. I don't know what he would have. You know, he talked about retirement, but it wasn't necessarily a conversation that I think he was committed to. I think he thought about retirement just because it was something that people at that age talked about and considered. But I'm not sure, other than maybe play a lot more golf, I'm not sure what he would have done had he retired, had he left television news, because I think he loved it that much. And again, for WQAD to have somebody like him on the staff, the kind of, my goodness, institutional knowledge that he brought to that job and brought to his work. I mean, you can't replace that. You just can't.
I remember he told me when he was thinking about retirement, and he was struggling with that, and then he came in one day and just told me, I'm not going to retire. I'm going to keep going. I'll never forget that. I also remember sitting around with him. He'd always come in, when I was assigning, he'd always come in with a story idea, or 2 or 3. And he'd already usually have them set up. He'd want the first photographer in, and they'd be back before noon. He'd have the story done. He was ready to go out and do another one. And, you know, it was just not like a lot of reporters that I had.
As I say, yeah, he was a storyteller. Yeah, he was a storyteller first and foremost. And I think that's why that and his commitment to the community are probably his lasting legacies, even this many years later. And when I say his commitment to the community, I'm talking about specifically, certainly, his involvement in what was then the Jerry Lewis Telethon, benefiting the Multiple Dystrophy Association and its fine work there in the Quad Cities and everywhere. You know, he ended up doing the Telethon for, my goodness, just decades. I don't know how many years it was, quite frankly. But it was something that, again, I think he, like his work, he fell in love with it and wanted to see where this effort could go. And he became so close to the clients, people who were receiving the kinds of benefits that the MDA was able to offer these people as they were going through literally the fight of their lives. And but my dad, you know, got close to these people and told those stories and really thought that we need to do something about this, and we need to help find some answers, and we need to help find a cure. And so his devotion to this particular effort was, my goodness, second to none. And again, something that, and Cliff, I think you would agree with this. There was nothing, whether it was doing the news or telling a story or reporting from Vietnam or Beirut or spending hours on the telethon asking people for donations. The one thing that I think probably set my dad apart from anybody else was he was just so authentic. He was genuine. There was nothing ever fake about what he did and how he did it. And that's not something that you can develop. It's either there or it's not. And certainly in my father's case, it was there.
Yeah. Yeah, he definitely had a passion for that. And it wasn't just a one-day thing on Labor Day that he did. What is it? He was on it year-round, worked with I remember him doing stories and working with the folks from Muscular Dystrophy Association. So it was a real passion.
Yeah, he would. It absolutely was, and it was a 365-day-a-year kind of commitment. Not only was he busy telling those stories, but he was also, he got to know the families, he got to know the clients. He would never miss MDA camp in the summer, where kids went for a few weeks out of the summer and got a chance to be just kids, and how important that was, not just to those kids and to their families, but it was something that, this wasn't an assignment for my dad. He wanted to be there, and he wanted to tell, especially those stories in particular, because he thought it would help the effort, especially when it came time for Labor Day weekend to come and the telethon was on. But again, and I go back to what I said, I mean, there was just, that kind of commitment, there was just a level of authenticity that, I remember he used to tell me, he told me a story once, and I've told this story countless times just in the course of my career. He said, he told me one day that there's just something about the lens of a television camera that can spot a phony like that. He said, I don't know what it is, I don't know how it works necessarily, but there's just something about the lens of a television camera that can spot a phony, and people know it. Listen, the audience isn't stupid. They're a lot smarter than sometimes we give them credit for. But they figured, I think they figured my dad out pretty quickly, and I think that again goes to the heart of his popularity and again all because of his commitment to community.
Here's a little bit of a funny story, and I don't think it was when we moved to Davenport. My in-laws lived there. And, I told them I was going to work at Channel 8, and they said, oh, that's the station that has the Jim King Telethon. And it wasn't the Jerry Lewis Telethon, it was the Jim King Telethon for muscular dystrophy. And I think there were a lot of people that thought of it that way.
I think you're right, and I remember those references too.
Do you remember the phone number you were supposed to call to make a donation?
797-7900.
That's right. Yep. I had to think about that for just a second the other day, and it came right to me. Yep. He said that about every other sentence, I remember.
Yeah, he did. He sure did. And there are still people who will reference that number on Facebook every once in a while who remember those days way back when.
Now, he won a lot of awards during his time. He had some hard-hitting editorials. He won some awards for his news reporting and anchoring, of course. There was one that you were telling me about from the regional Emmys. Can you tell us about that?
My father is, and I, just in the spirit of full disclosure, today I am president of NATIS Mid-America, which is the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences, the Mid-America chapter. We're based in St. Louis, but we cover television markets from the Quad Cities to the north all the way to Shreveport, Louisiana to the south, and all of the television markets in between. We're one of 19 chapters. And we do the Emmy Awards, and part of our part of the Emmy Award experience, for lack of a better way of putting it, is our Hall of Fame is the Natismith America Gold and Silver Circle. And the Gold Circle is a way to recognize people in our industry, in our region, who have spent 50 years in the business. The Gold Circle is 25. And this happened way before I became a member of the Board of Governors, so my fingerprints aren't on this. Wasn't then, even today. But in 2009, my dad was inducted posthumously into the Natismith America Gold Circle. And I remember the people at then Channel 8 who were behind the effort to try, and their goal was to get him into the Silver Circle because he hadn't reached 50 years experience in the business, but he certainly had 25 and certainly qualified for Gold Circle or for Silver Circle experience. But as it turns out, the nominating committee, the Natismith America Gold and Silver Circle nominating committee back then, decided that the body of his work and the kind of difference that he made in the community, not just reporting the news, but actually with his involvement certainly in the telethon and in other ways, that all of that combined, they really felt that he should be in the Gold Circle. And so, and he's one of, I think, about 4 or 5 people who have been inducted posthumously into our Gold Circle. If you look on our website, there aren't a lot of people in our Gold Circle. It's the best of the best. And he was inducted in 2009. And how proud I was to be able to accept that honor that night on his behalf. And then 3 years later, I was lucky enough to be inducted into our Silver Circle. We don't have a lot of father-son combinations in our Gold and Silver Circle. Jack Buck, the great Cardinal broadcaster in St. Louis, and his son Joe are both in our Silver Circle, but I don't know that we have another father-son duo that we have honored in this way. And you're right, Cliff. He won a ton of awards, and certainly I think he was probably embarrassed by most, if not all of them. But I think he really, the Gold Circle induction, I really think he would have dug that night if he'd have been here.
Well, Kris, I think maybe I'll wind it up there unless you have anything else you wanted to add.
There's one other moment that I don't know that I can do this interview without mentioning this. Father's Day 1998, which was obviously months before he passed away. I was anchoring the 5 o'clock news here at KMBC in Kansas City and reporting for our 10. And my news director at the time, a guy named Brian Bracco, who went on to become Senior Vice President of News for all of Hearst Television. He was a television general manager here in Kansas City. A guy who really became not just a big deal in our company, but a big deal in the industry across the country. Brian Bracco, who made me a weeknight anchor when I was on no anchor track whatsoever here at Channel 9, had this weird idea, and I remember him calling me into his office, and he said, Ketzer, what do you think your dad would come down here and anchor a Father's Day 10 o'clock newscast on a Sunday night with you? And I said, I don't know, I'll ask him. And sure enough, Dad said yes. Now, we had anchored a newscast or two at WQAD kind of by accident. I remember one night, the first night that we ever anchored together was a 6 o'clock at Channel 8 at WQAD, and his co-anchor at the time, Joan Brandenburg, had been called away suddenly to go cover a bank robbery in downtown Moline, and for whatever reason, they sent Joan and not me. And then I got pushed into her chair, and so that was the first time that we ever anchored a newscast together. But when Father's Day 1998 rolled around, again, it was a night that, man, I knew it was going to be fun, but I had no idea how much fun it would be. And it was one of the great nights in our life, and we still have people here at Channel 9. Our chief meteorologist, Brian Busby, was with us that night. And I still get people coming up to me who remember that night and remember how much fun it was to see father and son at work together doing what they love. And who knew that he would pass away that following January? But certainly one of the great nights in our family's history, and something that I will never forget, and will be indebted forever to the people here at KMBC and at Hearst Television, Bracco in particular, Paul Dino Dinovitz, our president general manager at the time, for coming up with the idea. And they just thought it would be they just thought it would be kind of cool, but what it meant to our family, I can't put a value on that.
Well, thank you for that. There's one other thing. Kinger always closed the newscast with he had his signature ending, signature close, and I think you do that as well, don't you? Why don't you give it to us, and we'll close our interview here.
I in the spirit of full disclosure, Cliff, yep, I rip off my father on a fairly regular basis. He ended every newscast with, "Thank you for inviting us into your home this evening," and that's exactly what I do here at KMBC 9 News. So, thank you for inviting us into your home this afternoon, this evening, whatever period of day it might be as you're watching this.
Great. Well, I think that's a pretty good ending, so I think we'll end there. Kris, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us about Kinger, Jim King, WQAD in the Quad Cities, legendary anchorman there.
Thank you, Cliff. My pleasure.
And I'm Cliff Brockman with producer Paul Yeager. This has been another of our oral history interviews for the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting.